Commander Rene Robert watched from the deck of the cruiser USS Nashville, CL-43, as explosions lit the night sky. From across the water, the concussive rumble of countless detonations assaulted his unprotected ears. From Robert's vantage point, it seemed the island was under assault from east and west, as cascades of fire rained down and clouds of smoke drifted over the landscape. The island was Manhattan, and the apparent assault was not hostility, but jubilation. Fireworks cast multicolored reflections on the Hudson and East Rivers to commemorate the nation's birthday on 4 July 1986. Highlights of the special celebration, proclaimed as Liberty Weekend, included the unveiling of the newly renovated Statue of Liberty and a nostalgic display of historic tall ships surrounding the majestic monument. Also included was a spectacular assemblage of U.S. and foreign warships gathered in the Hudson River for a naval review.
Earlier that day, Marine One had landed on the fantail of the USS Iowa, BB-61, with President Ronald Reagan on board. With the commander-in-chief accompanied by other luminaries well-positioned to see and be seen, the great battleship effortlessly parted the placid waters of the Hudson as she steamed southward past the warships. Reagan's diary records, "We sailed slowly down the river and bay, passing warships of 30-odd countries, and several of our own warships who fired 21-gun salutes. And of course, on all sides were the 40,000 private boats loaded with people." Naval reviews are always grand events, marked by pomp and circumstance. Awed onlookers admire powerful ships, their polished brass glistening in the sun, their masts and yards festooned with colorful flags. The air is festive, with bands playing and guns firing not in anger, but in tribute. The great event in 1986 was clearly intended to be a birthday party, celebrating the ideals of a nation that had much to be proud of. But beneath the pageantry of a naval review is a message calibrated for a specific audience. On this occasion, the awesome display of naval power, albeit proffered peacefully, was not without undertones.
The same presidential diary entry included musings on lunchtime discussions that day with French President François Mitterrand, who was headed for discussions with Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev about possible arms reduction talks. The Iowa was one of the battleships that had been recommissioned as part of Reagan's 600-ship Navy. The battleship was an imposing representation of that rejuvenating program aimed at deterring the Soviet Union. Beneath the Iowa's red, white, and blue bunting was a warship with some of the largest guns ever built, bolstered by a new array of modern missiles. And behind the festive pageantry was the threatening backdrop of the Cold War, with potential hostilities precariously held at bay by the better judgment of human beings with all their frailties and complexities. To most observers, Liberty Weekend was a grand festival aimed at commemorating the nation's past. To some, it was also a revelation of the present and a declaration of what the future might be if saner heads did not prevail. It was not the first American naval review with purposes beyond the obvious.
After the Civil War, the U.S. Navy fell into profound decline. While other navies capitalized on new technologies, including steam power, armor, and rifled guns, the number of U.S. warships dwindled to as few as 52, most of which were better suited to the 1840s than to this era of burgeoning technological change. The malaise continued for nearly 2 decades, until economic and missionary interests stimulated an appetite for a more powerful navy. Able pens wielded by sea power strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan and others at the Naval War College and the U.S. Naval Institute gradually led to the sharpening of naval swords as the number and quality of U.S. Navy ships increased. In 1883, Congress authorized the building of 4 steam-powered, steel-hulled ships, popularly called the ABCD ships, the Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, and Dolphin. Several years later, the battleships Maine and Texas were authorized, and in 1890, the same year that Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, appeared, Congress approved construction of the battleships Indiana, BB-1, Massachusetts, BB-2, and Oregon, BB-3.
By 1893, The United States had a new and capable navy, and it was time to let the world know. Foreign squadrons from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, Spain, Italy, and half a dozen other nations were invited to rendezvous at Hampton Roads and then proceed to New York for a grand naval review. The official motivation was to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's crossing, and while the commemoration was legitimate, the underlying point was not subtle. The United States had a modern steel fleet, and it wanted the world's navies to come see it. As the ships gathered at Hampton Roads, some 9,000 sailors descended on the Norfolk area, causing a short-term economic surge strong enough to result in a rise in prices. Hotels and restaurants benefited, but one exasperated reporter complained that a shave now ran 30 cents and only the wealthy could still afford a haircut, a small mirror of what was happening across the United States as the nation entered what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. Early arrivals to the festivities watched small boat races and life-saving competitions, and because many of the ships came with their own bands, there were frequent concerts. There was much gunfire as well. Each new arrival evoked gun salutes. When a reporter questioned the expenditure of gunpowder, he was told the shooters used condemned powder that was of no use in actual combat.
Once fully assembled, the Great Armada proceeded to New York. Just as would happen in 1986, the ships gathered in the Hudson River, this time to be reviewed by President Grover Cleveland, embarked on the dispatch vessel USS Dolphin. As the review progressed, a contemporary writer described the scene. The Hudson shone and sparkled with gala bunting, or flashing lights. Guns boomed and roared, whistles shrieked, bands sent martial strains echoing among the iron-walled fortresses. Men huzzaed, and women added their glove taps to the triumphant acclaim. The cacophony of gun salutes, blasting ship whistles, and blaring bands was joined by an unscheduled, thundering explosion as demolition crews deliberately brought down a New Jersey Palisades cliff on the western side of the river. It could be seen as a symbol for the shifting world landscape of the late 19th century, which closed out with innovators such as Thomas Edison, Rudolph Diesel, and John D. Rockefeller, bringing about momentous technological and economic changes.
In addition to 2 cruisers, Spain sent replicas of the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria that Columbus had used for his historic voyage. The 2 caravels and the Carrack were exceptionally well received, though they were dwarfed by the modern warships. Attesting to the courage and seamanship of those early explorers, a group of Brooklyn boatmen were overheard saying they would not want to sail them to Hoboken, New Jersey, much less across the Atlantic. There was a certain irony later realized, as the U.S. ships debuting on the Hudson would be sinking Spanish ships in the Philippines and the Caribbean in just 5 years. The Spanish-American War punctuated the message conveyed in the 1893 Naval Review. It announced that the United States intended to be an active participant in international affairs, and that the U.S. Navy had emerged as the latest player on the maritime stage.
In March 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt stood on the open deck of the presidential yacht Mayflower to observe a great assemblage of naval power passing in review. 16 battleships, manned by nearly 15,000 American sailors, steamed past the commander-in-chief, whose beaming smile reflected his pleasure at the spectacle. As the first ship steamed by, Roosevelt was heard to say it was a magnificent fleet, and indeed it was. With their brilliant white hulls, buff-colored superstructures, teak decks, and gilded scrollwork on their bows, they were a majestic lot. The ships might have passed for the yachts of the very rich, were it not for their heavy-caliber guns stowed in passive but formidable repose. This naval review had come about as part of a celebration of the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, but it also served the purposes of a president who understood that public spectacle could generate tangible support for a powerful fleet from both the people and the Congress who served them. The Naval Review of 1893 had announced that the Navy existed. The 1907 Jamestown Exposition Naval Review argued what it should become. The display was in keeping with Roosevelt's philosophy to speak softly and carry a big stick. It marked the beginning of a 15-month circumnavigation, during which the Great White Fleet steamed more than 40,000 miles
and stopped at 20 ports of call on 6 continents. Behind Roosevelt's decision to send the bulk of his navy on this around-the-world cruise was his conviction that we have no choice as to whether or not we shall play a great part in the world.
Well, before President Reagan used the 1986 Naval Review as a reminder of the continuing struggle between East and West, the 27 October 1945 Navy Day Fleet Review in New York celebrated the end of the greatest sea war in history. It also acknowledged the beginnings of a new kind of war, less overtly hostile but dangerous in new and terrifying ways. Unlike the other reviews, this one featured only U.S. ships, yet it was so large, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, amphibious ships, and many logistics and support vessels, that the 5 million observers saw multiple lines of ships stretching across the harbor and some distance up the Hudson. The event was explicitly cast as a victory celebration and included the battleship USS Missouri, BB-63, on board which Japan had recently formalized its surrender. Like the review in 1986, there was an underlying message.
After reviewing the ships from the bridge of the destroyer USS Renshaw, DD-499, which still bore the scars of a torpedo attack earlier that year, President Harry S. Truman delivered an afternoon address carried by all the radio networks. It began as a tribute to the Navy that had won the greatest naval victories in history, but warning that we have learned the bitter lesson that the weakness of this great republic invites men of ill will to shake the very foundations of civilization all over the world. Truman reaffirmed the importance of a strong Navy, armed with whatever weapons science brings forth, that is still dedicated to its historic task, control of the ocean approaches to our country and of the skies above them. He then turned to the future, laying out U.S. foreign policy in 12 fundamentals that included a commitment to basic human rights and declared that all peoples who are prepared for self-government should be permitted to choose their own form of government by their own freely expressed choice, without interference from any foreign source. Truman's manifesto laid the groundwork for the coming Cold War, and it rested on the sea power needed to meet the threat already rising in the East.
12 years later, another review recognized the founding of Jamestown, this time the 350th anniversary. Roughly 80 American warships were joined by some 30 ships from 17 other countries, all of them either NATO members or friendly nations. Conspicuously absent were ships from the Warsaw Pact. Images of the recreated Jamestown, with its primitive windmill, punitive stocks, and tiny ships that had brought the settlers, contrasted with aircraft carriers and battleships riding at anchor in Hampton Roads, sending a clear message of acquired strength and progress. In 1907, the emphasis had been on Rooseveltian navalism. In 1957, it was Cold War alliance solidarity. In 1976, the nation celebrated its 200th birthday with another great gathering of ships in New York Harbor. This review included more than 200 warships and square-rigged tall ships representing 50 nations. While there was no mistaking the display of American sea power, there was less emphasis on Cold War differences. The Soviet Union even sent a training tall ship.
Beneath the obvious reason for the gathering, it communicated the nation's resilience, despite the tragic end to the Vietnam War, serious economic problems, and the devastating Watergate crisis. Many viewed the bicentennial as a kind of rebirth.